students and colleagues across Syracuse University, and friends in the broader Syracuse community. It's a great honor and privilege for the Maxwell School and for Syracuse University to be welcoming former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright to campus to deliver the 8th Tanner Lecture on Ethics, Citizenship, and Public Responsibility. Our Chancellor, Kent Severud, wanted to be here as well, but another event involving path-breaking women, our women's basketball team's effort to win its first national championship, has understandably taken him from campus. But Madam Secretary, he extends his welcome to you as well. I'm Grant Reeher, Director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, the institute which organizes the Tanner Lecture Series, and I'd like to tell you briefly about the series and its sponsor. Lynn Tanner is a Maxwell PhD. He's the founder and executive chair of Tech Canada, an enterprise which generates ideas and social capital among top corporate leaders. Lynn's life and career have been concerned with the joining of theory and practice and posing challenges to commonly held distinctions between the public and private sectors. The intention of the lectures is to ask urgent questions about ethical citizenship, public responsibility, and mutual obligations. And I want to thank Lynn and his spouse, Margaret, for their vision and their generosity in making the lectures possible. He was not able to be in attendance today, but I'd like to ask all of us to thank him in a way that he can hear even through the live stream of the program. But I am also pleased that Lynn's nephew, Cameron Tanner, and his spouse, Linnell Harpst, are in the audience. So thanks to the two of you for making the time to join us. I want to thank the staff at Hendricks Chapel, the Information and Computing Technology Group at the Maxwell School, the Learning Environments Group at the university, and the staff at the Campbell Institute and the Maxwell Dean's Office. Our format this afternoon will be for our Maxwell Dean, Jim Steinberg, to engage Secretary Albright in a conversation. As a former Deputy Secretary of State, Jim's background is ideal for this. That conversation will be followed by an additional conversation with all of you. And for that purpose, we've placed 2 microphones in either aisle. When we get to that stage, please line up behind the microphones to ask your questions, and we will alternate between them. We probably won't be able to get to all of you, but we'll do our best. And to that end, please be brief with your questions or comments. While I'm on reminders about the process, I'll also ask you to silence your smartphones now if you haven't already done that. And following our event here at around 4:30 or so, you're invited to make your way across the street to 220 Agers Hall, to the Paul and Natalie Strasser Legacy Room, and to the Commons on the 2nd floor, where there will be a reception with refreshments. And now finally, a few words about our speaker. Madeleine Albright was the first female Secretary of State. But it gets better. When she assumed that position in 1997, she became the highest-ranking woman in the history of the United States government. She's currently chair of Albright Stonebridge Group and of Albright Capital Management. Among her authored books is a memoir, Madam Secretary. In 2012, President Obama awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the United States. Secretary Albright, as a trailblazing woman, you have come to the right place to speak. This area has a rich tradition in that regard. From Harriet Tubman to the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, to National Organization for Women President Karen DeCrow, to Oneida Nation singer and songwriter Joanne Shenandoah, to our current political executives and SU alums, Joni Mahoney and Stephanie Miner, and there are many others. It's a thrill and an honor to have you here. Welcome.
Let me first thank Grant for his great leadership of the Campbell Institute and express my appreciation to all of you and such a wonderful audience here today. In fact, this is such an impressive audience, it almost rivals the group I expect we'll see this evening at the Sheraton to root on the women's team in the finals. Madeleine, for me, it's a particular honor. You've been, for me, for over 30 years, a mentor, a colleague, and a friend. And on behalf of all of us, welcome to Syracuse University.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank Grant for telling everybody who I am, because not everybody always knows. Not long ago, I was coming back from China, and Chicago was the first port of entry, and I was there getting undressed for the security people, and I put my stuff down on the conveyor belt, and the lady behind me said, "So where'd you get all those screw-top bottles? My bottles all leak." I said, "Well, I got them at the Container Store." And then I was going through the magnetometer. The TSA guard looked at me and said, "Oh my God, it's you." He said, "I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia, and if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia, and you're always welcome in Bosnia, and can I have my picture taken with you?" So we have our picture taken, the whole line gets screwed up. I go back to get my stuff, and the lady of the screw-top bottle says, "So what exactly happened here?" And I said, "Well, I used to be Secretary of State," and she said, "Of Bosnia?" So, Grant, thank you.
A legend in your own time. Well, as I say, it's great to have you here, and I think, you know, Grant talked a lot about your accomplishments and your achievements, but what's particularly notable here on a university campus is that you're one of us. You're an academic as well. You've PhD, you've been teaching, and I wanted to start by talking about that and asking you about how your own experience, your training as an academic, your experiences both as a student and a teacher have influenced or had an impact on your professional, your public life as a Secretary of State, as a UN ambassador in the public arena.
Well, a lot of influence, and it's great to be with you, Jim. We really have known each other for a long time. You influenced me a lot. But let me say, I think that what is important as one looks at the large picture of representing your country is try to figure out to what extent what you are doing at that moment fits into the large sweep of the foreign policy of your country, and also how it relates to what is going on in terms of the issues that you have to deal with. So there's no question that you don't just dip back, but you are immersed in what you have learned and why you have learned it. I think the thing that is the hardest, however, is to keep up with what you need for kind of having some capital in terms of what you've learned and how you keep learning, because we've talked about this. I think that instead of having the opportunity to read books and even long articles, what happens is you read each other's memos, and I think that I missed very much having discussions with my academic colleagues, and I tried very hard at various times to bring some into the State Department to have discussions, what I called no-fault discussions, not anything they might say, but just in not having anybody interpret the kinds of questions that I asked as some direction that I wanted to go in. But I do think that it is very important to have the background, the historical background, the disciplines in terms of the things that you learn, the variety of disciplines that you need, some philosophical aspect, and then really a historical approach to things. So, and the truth is, Jim, I don't think at a time that you're making decisions that you actually think, aha, I did that in, you know, Poli-Sci 105 or whatever, but that's something that you really did learn.
Take us back to that first transition when you left the university environment to go to work in the government for the first time. What were the challenges? What was it like to make that transition? What did you need to learn to be able to do your job?
Well, it was a little bit different. What happened is it did take me forever to get my PhD. And the issue was, I went first to work in the legislative branch for Senator Ed Muskie as his chief legislative assistant, and trying then to figure out how what I had learned really fit in with what the legislative process was like. You were on the Hill also at a certain point for Senator Kennedy, and it's a little bit different in terms of the practicality of it. I think then what happened was, after I had worked for him, I did go to work at the National Security Council in the Carter administration for Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had been my professor. And by the way, that was interesting. When he was made National Security Advisor, he called me up and he said, Madeleine, perhaps you've heard that I've been made National Security Advisor. I said, yes. He said, well, I'm calling to ask you to find me a place to live. And I said, geez, Big, I thought you were calling to offer me a job. And he said, no, I'm calling to ask you to find me a place to live. But I think that what was interesting was, it was very interesting specifically, and it goes to your first question, to be actually working for your professor, and at the same time trying to very much fit into a governmental process where there already were, I did legislative relations, so trying to fit it in to the practical aspect of it, and at the same time, believe it or not, teaching your professor about what United States Congress was about. He was very good at the Soviets. And so I think they're really, but it was a transition in terms, and that was before I went to teach. Once I went to teach, which was in the 80s afterwards, it was interesting to try to use the information that I had learned in the government in order to be a professor at Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service, which is one that operates in terms of training people not just to be in the Foreign Service, but in a variety of international relations activities, then trying to bring the government experience into academia. And the thing that I have found, and then I went into the government again, and now I'm teaching again, and so kind of that going back and forth between the two is endlessly interesting, but not necessarily easy, because there is a different approach, and trying to meld the approaches is something that I find very fascinating and useful to do.
So part of what you brought to your work as a public servant in the NSC and the State Department was your experience and your training as an academic, but you also brought a unique set of experiences from your own personal life and an engagement in the bigger world of international relations that most people who go into government haven't had. Talk about how that experience, the experience of your childhood of coming to the United States, how that affected your own approach to thinking about foreign policy and international relations.
Well, let me say, in many ways, you know, some people said that I had always wanted to be Secretary of State or in the government. It never occurred to me. I'd never seen a woman Secretary of State, so it didn't occur to me. But I think the thing that I was concerned about all my life was, what is the role of the most powerful country in the world? And we all, I think that as we teach and talk about foreign policy, I try to talk about the role of the individual, and we all come with our own background and baggage. So mine was the following. I was born 2 years before World War II. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat. And one of the things as a Czechoslovak that had always been most meaningful was Munich. And that was an agreement made by the British and French over the heads of the Czechoslovaks with the Germans and Italians. The United States was not involved. So then, as a result of that, my father went to England and he served with the government in exile, and I lived through the Blitz. And then the Americans arrived. And even as a little girl, it was very evident what happened when the United States, the Yanks, arrived. It was amazing. Then, as a result of decisions made during World War II, Czechoslovakia was, quote, liberated by the Soviet Union, not by the United States. Ultimately, my father became Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia. The little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport, that's what I did for a living. And then the communists took over and we came to the United States. And so I can continue this thread, but watching when America was involved made a difference, and when America was not involved also made a difference. That's kind of the baggage that I came with. And I really had studied a lot about what America's role should be, and so I think I was pretty much an activist. I am a naturalized citizen, and to have the honor of sitting behind a sign that says the United States was really incredible. So I first did that at the UN. And being a permanent member of the Security Council and representing the most powerful country, and having come to the United States as a result of the UN, my baggage really is very much a part of how I saw American foreign policy. And one of the issues was when President Clinton took over, it was after years where not enough attention had been paid to domestic policy, and yet it was evident that we had to be engaged. And so what happened, first President Clinton used the term indispensable. about the United States. I then said it so often it became identified with me. There is nothing in the word indispensable that says alone. It just means that we need to be engaged. And so my baggage is that I believe in America being engaged internationally. Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and it ends in an ism. But all it means is partnership. So that's kind of where my thinking and my baggage comes from.
But there's been a lot of debate about the question about how we should decide when we should engage. The question about whether the United States is the world's policeman or whether we have to be responsible for everything. How should we think about the question about when we get engaged, or what criteria we should use? What should drive that decision about this world? Does the fact that we're indispensable mean that we have to be in every problem and every challenge?
I don't think we have to be in every problem. I do think that one of the things that has gotten more complicated is the interaction of various activities all over the world. I know a lot of people think of international relations as a game of chess. It is not a game of chess. That's two people sitting quietly making decisions and time between their moves. It's more like a game of pool, billiards, where there are balls in the middle of a table and somebody comes up with a cue stick and wants to hit a ball into a pocket and it hits a bunch of balls along the way. It's horizontal and dynamic. And trying to figure out what ball is affected by what is what making foreign policy is about, and trying to make decisions about the consequences of decisions. I do think there are issues that other countries can deal with. But I do think that we do have a responsibility to understand what is going on, develop our priorities, and then decide under what circumstances we get involved. But I think the worst part is if we decide that it doesn't matter. And I have always said there are a lot of problems that happen that ultimately come home to America, and then we have to deal with them. But I know when we were both in the government, the question is trying to figure out what is, you lay out, well, you wrote a book about transitions. And so basically, you kind of think about what are the issues that are going to come up. A new administration always begins with a set of reviews of policies. What does happen, though, is that often the urgent pushes out the important, and then you try to figure out how to put it together. But it is difficult. I just do think the worst thing, from my perspective, is if the United States completely sits something out and lets countries that we don't have dealings with deal with something, and then we have to come in and pick the pieces up later. I am an activist. There's no question about that.
So you've had a lot of different roles at senior levels in government, and in the Clinton administration, your first role was at the United Nations. And there's a lot of question, a lot of debate about exactly what the role and responsibility of the UN should be. A lot of skepticism, frankly, about the effectiveness of the UN, whether it's dealing with conflicts, like the conflicts we see in the Middle East, or dealing with public health, like the Ebola crisis. What were your takeaways from your time as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations? And what should we expect from the UN? What, if anything, can we do to make a difference? I know you worked with former Nigerian Foreign Minister Gambari on a project to look at this. Where does it fit in?
Well, let me just say, we'll go back to my background. The reason that we got to the United States is that my father's last assignment was to be the Czechoslovak representative on a new commission to do with India and Pakistan over Kashmir. He's dead, I'm old, and it's worse than ever. So it's but it did make me I was the perfect daughter, so I always studied about everything, so I knew a lot about the UN. And I think the thing that qualified me to become ambassador was that I won the United Nations contest for the Rocky Mountain Empire, which would be Colorado, Wyoming, because I could name the countries in alphabetical order. There were 60 at that time. Anyway, so I have been a UN-nick for a long time. What was interesting when I got there in 1993 was after the end of the Cold War, and President Bush had actually begun to see the value of using the UN in kind of as backing for the Gulf War. And it was fascinating because we saw the UN at that time as a very good instrument for dealing with a number of the problems, and it had come alive. And one of the issues, and I taught about this yesterday, is what the role of peacekeeping operations was going to be and how we operated within them. And I think when I got there, there were 60,000 peacekeepers out. But the UN itself, just as an example, was the global emergency number, but it was only worked from 9 to 5 and not on the weekends. And so we kept trying to figure out how to make it work better. And there are any number of reforms that came about. The problem was that we were not paying our dues at the UN or our peacekeeping bills, and our question was we wanted to reform it, and reforming the UN is very difficult. So my takeaway is the following. How many hours did you and I spend talking about enlarging the Security Council? So we had decided that Germany and Japan should be permanent members of the Security Council. So the first country to come to me to complain was Italy, saying, this is outrageous, we lost the war too, which is not a great campaign slogan. And then what would happen, out of 15 members of the Security Council, there were usually 5 Europeans in some form, and I would go to a European ambassador and say, I need your help on X vote, and the ambassador would say, I'm so sorry, I can't help you. The EU does not yet have a common position. And then 2 days later, I go back to the same person and say, can you help me now? And the ambassador would say, no, the EU does have a common position, which means that the EU should have the permanent seat that the British and French have. You know that's not going to happen. So it's kind of a Rubik's Cube activity. And then there is a question about, did the World Health Organization, what did it do as far as Ebola is concerned? Is the UN Refugee Commission operating really in a forward-leaning way at this point in terms of what's happening in Europe? So I think there are real questions. I do think the UN does need to be activated more, and we need to see it as an important part of our toolkit. But there are Americans who fully believe that the UN has Black Hawk helicopters that swoop down in the middle of the night to steal your lawn furniture. And then there are people who don't like the UN because it's full of foreigners, which can't be helped. So, we kind of have to figure out how to use it better because we need an international organization. So my takeaway was it needs reform, and the U.S. needs to be more active in moving the reform process forward.
You then moved from there to the State Department, and as we've recognized today, you were the first woman Secretary of State, first woman to take that position. What were the particular challenges that you faced as a woman taking on this role as the first time in that position?
Well, let me just say what is interesting. My youngest granddaughter, when she was 7 years ago, said, so what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State, so in her lifetime, And now there are a lot of little boys that are looking at John Kerry and thinking, I can be Secretary of State. The challenges really were the following, and what is interesting, when my name came up, there were people who said that a woman couldn't be Secretary of State because Arab leaders would not deal with a woman. The ambassadors, the Arab ambassadors at the UN had said, at some stage they put out a statement saying we had no problems dealing with Ambassador Albright. We would have no problems dealing with Secretary Albright. Frankly, not you, but I had more problems with the men in our own government. And not because they were all male chauvinist pigs, but because they had known me for such a long time. I had been the carpool mother. I had had them over to my house for dinner. I had been a staffer. I had made a lot of coffee and Xerox. And then they thought, how is she Secretary of State when I should be Secretary of State? So there were issues in terms of, there were questions all the time whether a woman could do the job. I did not have problems abroad. I did arrive in a large plane that said United States of America, and foreigners did know that they had to deal with me. But I think it was an issue in terms of how views were stated, or this is not going to surprise anybody, when I was told not to be so emotional or be shrill or what I had on. And so there were a number of different things. But in terms of the subjects, I think it worked, and I think in many ways you'd probably agree with this. I was kind of a bureaucratic disaster because I wanted to work with the people. I didn't like going through the chain of command. I wanted to talk to the country directors, and it was heaven for somebody that was a foreign policy junkie. I mean, I was able to deal with every subject. I loved every minute of it.
So there are a lot of people, though, just kind of an image of the State Department as fuddy-duddies, striped pants. Talk a little bit about your experience with the Foreign Service. We have a lot of students here who are either going into the Foreign Service or thinking about serving their country in that way. What did you learn from them? And as young people think about the potential of a career in the State Department, what would you tell them about the opportunities?
I think they're a remarkable group of people in terms of their dedication to their jobs, America, and then their capability of learning about the countries where they're going and their dedication to the service. What was really fun for me was that I did have a lot of students that were in the Foreign Service, and as I traveled around, I would see them in different jobs, and watching them your first question, use their education in order to serve this country, I think was remarkable. I think it is a remarkable service. I think it's not so much that people thought that people have the wrong image of the Foreign Service, that they're fuddy-duddies. I think there are a lot of people who think it's just fancy going to receptions and having servants and things. I think the thing that is very evident is a very dangerous job. And that now even more dangerous than ever. And one of the things that I said I loved being Secretary of State, except on one day, when August 7th, 1998, when our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were blown up. And various things I never thought I would do is bring American bodies home, covered in flags, and then try to explain to their families what had happened. And there was a time, there's a wall in the State Department where the names of people that have died in service, and at a certain stage there were more diplomats than military line officers that had died. And so I think we need to see our Foreign Service officers as dedicated representatives of this country without whom we can do nothing. So I'm very proud of the ones that I served with.
So one of the challenges that you faced, and I think it's an ongoing challenge, is getting the financial and resource support for the State Department. In contrast to the Pentagon, some of the other agencies, there has been an ongoing challenge in persuading Congress and the American people that it's worth investing in diplomacy. You had a very unique relationship with Congress when you were Secretary of State, and particularly with the chairman of your authorizing committee at the time. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and your own experiences with the chairman, and how you approach the question of trying to build congressional support for the work of the State.
Well, what I found very interesting, and I love studying our government, and I think executive legislative relations are among the most interesting that are out there. It's at the real nexus of the government, and you learn an awful lot about how things work. I was delighted to have had the opportunity to have worked on the Hill, to understand it, then do my NSC part of it, and learn what it was like to see the Senate or the Congress from the executive branch. So this was something that I really liked. One of the things that did happen was I was ambassador at the UN, and I have made a number of mistakes of things I've said, and one of the things had to do with money at the UN. And I was already ambassador, and there was the question, there are really two budgets at the United Nations. There's the regular one, dues, and then there's the peacekeeping budget. And we were very far behind on the peacekeeping budget, and every time I wanted to push for reform, we were actually creating an artificial financial crisis, leading our best friends, the British, in the General Assembly session to deliver a line they had waited over 200 years to say, representation without taxation. So it made it a little difficult. So I would argue all the time and go talk for money. And on the House side one time, I was testifying, and I actually said, it's really hard representing a deadbeat. And one of the members of Congress said, if you don't like it, quit, or you should be fired. And so I had to go apologize for calling us a deadbeat, but it really was a problem. So then what happens is Jesse Helms called me up, and a women's college in Raleigh was celebrating its bicentennial, and he said, would you please go and speak at St. Mary's? They invited you. And I actually thought I could get out of it by saying, yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd be delighted if you go with me. He said, well, that's an interesting idea. Let me call you back. So he calls me back in half an hour. He says, I'm going with you. So one of the things that's true is when somebody wants you to go somewhere and they're supposed to introduce you, they're not going to say, this is the dumbest person I ever met. So very nice introduction. And then the students started asking about the UN, so I had a chance to answer all that. So as we're flying back, he said, I have a really interesting idea. Why don't you go with me to my alma mater? So next time we go to North Carolina, we go to Wingate, and he picks me up in Raleigh, and we're driving around looking for barbecue places, and by then he had artificial hips, and by the time we get to Wingate, I'm helping him out of the car, I'm hanging on to him, and there's this photograph, and it's titled The Odd Couple. And so at his alma mater, I'm asked about the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and all kinds of things, and we really did get to be friends. And when I was named secretary, he said, Ms. Madeleine, we will make history together. And if anybody watches the tapes of this, the number of times that he would wink at me and really be very supportive, he was essential in the expansion of NATO and any number of things. We disagreed about a lot of things, but I think that that relationship was a very important one. The budget part was an issue, and just consider this. I don't know how many people know this. The budget for the Pentagon is around $600 billion. The budget for the State Department doesn't make $50 billion. It is ridiculous in terms of the things that have to be done. And out of the State Department budget, you not only pay for the diplomats and the buildings and the security, but also the programs and support for international organizations and what is known as foreign assistance. I personally, putting those two words together is like selling some terrible disease. So it needs to be called national security support. And it's very hard to get the money for it. And it is something always that the Secretary of State has to go and testify about, but it is hard.
So, we hear a lot about polarization now, gridlock and the like. I mean, are there any lessons that you take away from your partnership with Jesse Helms and advice that you can give about how we might try to find more common ground for going forward?
Well, I think when I worked for Ed Muskie, who was, some of the people in this room will remember, a candidate for president and somebody that had been a governor and a foremost Democrat. He was the first chairman of the Budget Committee. And one of the first things he did was say to us as his staffers, you are going to go work with Henry Bellman, the ranking member, a Republican from Oklahoma. And the only thing that works is when you actually work across the aisle. And I think the lesson is that you don't have to agree with somebody on everything, but our system only works if there is respect and civility across the aisle. And I'm very troubled by the kinds of things that are going on now. I am chairman of the board of an organization called the National Democratic Institute that talks about democracy and abroad, and actually it's an organization that was founded by President Reagan. He had gone to London in 1983 to talk about that democracy was not real good in explaining itself vis-a-vis communism, so he came back and he started the National Endowment for Democracy, and it has a Democratic Institute, a Republican one, and business and labor. So at the moment we're in 60 countries and we talk about the nuts and bolts of democracy. So I was in some country recently and they said, so what's the most important element of democracy? And I said, compromise. And they said, yeah, like you guys. So at the moment, we're not exactly a good example of it, but I do think it's absolutely essential.
So obviously there's a lot of conflict between the executive branch and Congress, but we read a lot about potential conflict within the executive branch. Talk about working with the other parts of the executive branch, with the Defense Department, with the CIA, with the NSC. I mean, how does the system work, and what do we need to change it? Does it meet the challenges of the 21st century?
Well, what is interesting is that to go back to your first question, I love studying our system of government and courses that I took about that. But then when you put what you read and learn into real action, it's kind of interesting to see how it works. So what is interesting is our decision-making system is based on an act of 1947, the National Security Act. And it was done the way it was because the bureaucracy did not like the way that Franklin Roosevelt made decisions. He pitted his people against each other. So often the NSC system is called the bureaucrat's revenge of trying to get some kind of order into it. And it was a way to try to get a system whereby the various departments, it created the Defense Department and the CIA at the same time, and it was a way of trying to figure out how the ultimate decider, the president, gets information. And it is the most flexible part of the government, and every president does it in different ways. Harry Truman was the first person to have the NSC. He decided he didn't want to be told how to make decisions. He walked out of the first meeting, leaving the Secretary of State in charge. Eisenhower did, he was very military, everybody had his horse holder, everything was very well organized. The most powerful, or the biggest, was under Nixon when Henry Kissinger created 6 committees and chaired all of them. And so everybody does it differently. There is natural animosity, and often people say that the only time that Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor got along was when Henry had both jobs at the same time. But a lot of it is based in terms of trying to get different information. And I have to tell you, and I think you've had the same experience, where you sit is where you stand. So when I worked for Brzezinski at the NSC and all this paper would come in from the State Department, you'd say, you know, what are these people doing? You know, what do they do? All they do is produce paper and nothing is ever useful, and we have to get this together and digest it and give it to the president, and you really think, who are they? So then when I was Secretary of State, I kept saying, who are these people in the White House who never let anything I have to say get to the president? So it is an issue. I think what is interesting, and you have sat and you all have seen pictures of the Situation Room, is that what is important about making a decision-making system work is to give the president, you know, to have the opportunity to discuss views that might be different. And a really good national security advisor is somebody who makes sure that the different departments are actually able to state their views, even if they don't agree with each other. So it's kind of to break the eggs and make sure that you have a real discussion. Then, sometimes the National Security Advisor can make an omelet out of it and present a common view to the president, or if he or she can't make an omelet out of it, you give the egg mess to the president, and you are able to go and discuss it in front of him or her. And so the issue then becomes how you make sure that the President of the United States has access to a diversity of views. But it doesn't work if you have to go into a meeting and just say yes, yes. And if the people don't respect each other enough in order to state the views and argue them clearly and be able to deal with arguments against what they've said. And they're fascinating meetings, and some of them go on forever, but basically the basis of the decision-making process in a democracy is able to get those different views. That is the crucial part.
So one of the most legendary moments of those different views in your personal narrative is probably the one that's best known to a wider public, which was some of the discussions around the conflict in the Balkans, and particularly the discussion between you and General Powell about a U.S. engagement there. And I want to ask the broader question about the role of the military as part of our foreign policy, and particularly under what circumstances is it appropriate for a civilian like you, to try to challenge the judgment of military officers about when and how the military should be used?
Well, I think that one of the most interesting parts is, again, in studying the history of all this, are the arguments that have gone on between the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. And interestingly enough, more often than not, it's the Secretary of State that wants to use force. And they'd started way back, but one that I've studied is Schultz-Weinberger. They disagreed in terms of when they should use force. And there clearly are times where the Secretary of State can make statements about using force but has no airplane, so has to persuade the Defense Department. So this is what happened, and I had an opportunity to meet with students earlier today, and we were actually talking about Bosnia. So again, in terms of what you know when you are making a decision or where you sit, is so I was at the United Nations, well, the Bosnia issue began in the early 90s, and the first President Bush had not wanted to do much about Bosnia because he'd just done the Gulf War and there were real questions about interest in it. Governor Clinton had talked about the necessity of doing something about Bosnia, and then when he came into office, he knew that there was the economy stupid and questions about gays in the military and a number of things where it was hard to get movement on Bosnia. And yet I was in New York where I saw more different diplomats than any American diplomat. Whoever was in Germany saw more Germans or whatever, but I saw everybody. And the number of people that would come to me and say, why aren't you people doing anything about Bosnia? And then I would go to these principals meetings in order to argue. By the way, even as a UN ambassador, President can make this decision. But President Clinton made me a member of the cabinet and also a member of this principals committee. That doesn't happen all the time. So I was equal at the table, and I was able to talk about this. I was the only woman at the table. And, but I kept arguing, and General Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He was the hero of the Western world. He had just won the Gulf War. And he would come in, big, handsome man, dressed in a uniform with medals from here to here. And I would be sitting there as a mere mortal female civilian, arguing about the use of force. And then, you know, the Pentagon's brilliant in their briefing. They have 3D things, and by the way, today is Colin Powell's birthday, and I spoke to him yesterday, and we are really good friends. And we do talk about this event fairly frequently. But he, anyway, had a little red indicator, and he was a brilliant briefer, and he'd say, yes, we can do this in Bosnia, but it will take you know, many thousands of troops and zillions of dollars and take forever. And what are you going to tell Sergeant Slepčak's mother when he has died as a result of stepping on a landmine in Bosnia? So he'd lead you up the hill and drop you off the other side. So I had the temerity to say, Colin, what are you saving this military for? And he got furious at me. Anyway, he left, and General Shalikashvili came in, talking about different personalities and backgrounds, and he wanted to do something in Bosnia, and we actually did use force, and we won. So Colin wrote a book, and one of the things that all of us who write books know, they take a while to publish. So all of a sudden, I get a call from a reporter saying, so what do you have to say to what General Powell said about you in his book? I said, well, what did he say? He said, well, that Ambassador Albright practically gave him an aneurysm with her suggestions about the military, and that he patiently had to explain to me that our soldiers were not toy soldiers. So I called him up and I said, Colin, patiently? And he said, yes, you didn't understand anything. And so he sent me his book, and he signed it with love, admiration, et cetera, patiently, Colin. And then I sent him a note back saying, with love, admiration, et cetera, forcefully, Madeleine. But it is hard. And then one of the other things that happened in Kosovo, for instance, we had used air power at that point, and there really was a question as to whether at some point we would have to send in ground forces. And we met with the military again, and I said, by then I was secretary, and I said, I don't quite understand this. We have been bombing for 78 days, and you say that we have to have a permissive environment. Isn't it possible that there's something like semi-permissive? And so they said, people aren't semi-dead. And so the military, it is hard for a mere mortal civilian to argue with the military, but nothing can be done if you don't have the military on your side on this. And so I love to do Kosovo as a case study of something where I thought the State Department had the right position, the President agreed, but you have to bring your own government along with it, which was difficult, and then we had to bring the international community along with it, which was also difficult, and so to go back again to initial thing, how do you decide what you're going to do, and what are the bureaucratic politics of getting them, and you had to get congressional support for it.
So before we move on to your post-government career, I have to ask one last State Department-oriented question, which is, what do you think of the TV show, Madam Secretary?
So let me say this. What happened was, crazy things that happened. I get a phone call from the producers of it, and they said, Taya Loney would like to meet with you to find out what it's like to be Secretary of State. So we're actually having lunch, and I'm telling her what it's like, and I thought, I must be out of my mind talking about seriously what it's like to be Secretary of State. Then I talked to the producers, and they were going over things with me, and I thought, okay, I do watch television, by the way, and I have decided as a rationalization, I don't know how many people here watched a program called Army Wives, that I learned a lot about what it was like for a wife to live on a base, and that it was useful for a show to bring up complicated issues so that people might get some sense for them. So then what happened was, many people have heard about this crazy thing in Washington, the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So the CBS invited me to be their guest last year. So I go with them, and every time somebody said, Madam Secretary, she would turn around. But they asked me to be on it. I had a great time. I could do many things in life, but not do TV permanently, because for a short thing that took a minute, it took 5 hours to film. So, but I think it's kind of a fun show. I do, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. So after you left government at the end of your time as Secretary of State, you've become very active in a variety of capacities. And one of the things we've seen a lot of in recent years is former government officials, including at the highest levels, former presidents, become very active on the international stage. We have President Carter, who's been very active in a range of issues, ranging from global public health to peacemaking issues. President Clinton, obviously, with the global initiative. What is the role? What are the roles and responsibilities of a former official in terms of continuing to be engaged?
Well, I do think that there are responsibilities, because you have, in fact, done a lot of different things. I actually think that people have a responsibility to write a book, because it may be their version of history, but students actually then, the job in doing research is to compare different analyses of things. And so I do think there is that responsibility. I think also there is a responsibility to be available, to be helpful. So one of the things that happened was for the 60th anniversary of NATO, I was asked to look at a new strategic concept for NATO. What happened was there was a new Secretary General, and the leaders that were meeting in Strasbourg thought that the new Secretary General, there should be a group of experts to help develop a new strategic concept. So every country named an expert, and the U.S. named me, and then Rasmussen decided that, the Secretary General, that the experts group would only be 12 countries, automatically irritating 16 countries, and then he asked me to chair it. But it was really interesting in terms of using some of the knowledge that I'd gained for a purpose. I now serve on the Defense Policy Board and the CIA External Advisory Board. So I think we're all honored to be asked to do something. And I do think there is a responsibility. I think there are differences in terms of when you give private advice and when you are, but I've gone to testify on the Hill, a number of things. I meet with, informally with various caucuses and things. I also do think one of the parts is when I still travel abroad, that I meet a lot of people that I've dealt with before, and there is kind of a interaction among people. One of the things I've done that I love dearly is what happened during the war in Kosovo, I invented something which really sounds antediluvian at this point, is the diplomatic conference call with telephones, hard lines. And so we talked every single day with 5 foreign ministers of the Quint, the British, the Germans, the French, Italians, and me. And we would compare notes about what was going on, all on open lines. And we got to know each other very, very well. So what happened when I was out of office, the Brit was Robin Cook, who was head of the European Socialists. And he came out of a meeting in Brussels and he said, Madeleine, people are saying terrible things about the US, do something. So then the next phone call was from the former Dutch foreign minister who'd spoken to the French and said, things are terrible, call Madeleine. I'm out of office, trying to figure out what. And so I decided to form a group of former foreign ministers. At the moment, it's under the auspices of the Aspen Institute, and its official name is the Aspen Ministers Forum. Its unofficial name is Madeleine and Her Exes. We have been meeting now for 15 years, whenever we want, and talk about things without our national positions. So we are meeting in 2 weeks in Oslo, and it grows by virtue of what it is. We are talking about the refugee situation. And many of the ministers are from Europe, and I think that we have a capability and a responsibility. Some of them are still in their parliaments or involved in a number of ways, and I think we do use our backgrounds and our expertise to talk about issues.
What are the public responsibilities? I mean, I can remember, and you'll remember, that there was a certain tension between President Clinton and our administration and President Carter over Haiti, over North Korea, and the like. When you play this role, do you have any responsibility or obligation to not publicly be at odds with the sitting president? Does it cause problems to have a former president, a former Secretary of State take a position which is different or even adverse to the one that the government of the United States is taking?
Depends on who's the president. No, I think it is. I think that it is. It truly does depend. I do think that if you see things going really wrong, that with a collection of people in some way, not usually to do it abroad, but I do think that people have a responsibility. We're a democracy. We have to, but I think it has to be done in a responsible way, and it has to be done, I think, actually, in having some way of letting it be known that you disagree. I mean, but I do think, and I think you were talking about President Carter or President Clinton, it happened. And I think that there was respect, there was animosity, but there was some respect. But it goes on now. And I do think we expect our former officials to speak what they believe. It's useful if people actually speak on the basis of some rational facts, which may not be happening all the time. But I do think that we are a democracy, and we criticize other countries when former officials cannot speak. So I do think it's important.
In your current life, you mentioned your role as chair at NDI, a non-governmental organization. You're obviously now involved in the private sector with your firm. What is the role of these actors in the international system? You talked about the old days and the old-fashioned Concert of Europe, Congress of Berlin thing, where the business of foreign policy was conducted by foreign ministers, and yet we see more and more organizations like NDI or foundations like the Gates Foundation playing a role. How do they fit in, and how do you envision sort of thinking about the international system now with these different kinds of actors?
Well, I think it's a very key problem and issue, and something that I had noticed some time ago about the fact that what we call non-state actors actually have an increasing role in the system. And the truth is, the UN is based on the Westphalian system of state actors, and yet you see more and more different actors playing roles. And so I found interesting when I was secretary already to see the role of the private sector, that when I traveled abroad, I would often meet with representatives, this was when I was secretary, with representatives of our corporation somewhere that had a different take on what was going on in the country from some of our diplomats. They had, in China, for instance, they had good labor policies or health policies, and they could, in fact, kind of project some of our values without actually being ambassadors. And so I did see some combination of the public and private sector working together. The thing that I see now, for instance, you were talking about NGOs, they play a very large role. Some of them are connected in some way to the United Nations, some of them are not, or the EU. They are kind of independent players, and the question is how they're operating, and is there any cooperation among each other? Is there duplication, or are there lacunae where nothing happened? Then there are the corporations. So take a corporation, anyone, Coca-Cola, for instance, is in every country. It has to use local resources. It has a budget, I don't know what it is, huge, but maybe 10 times the size of, take Lithuania, and Lithuania ended up as president of the Security Council. Coca-Cola or any company is never at the table at the beginning of decisions. They come in later. And so the question is whether there's some way to get the non-state actors into the system. One place where some of this has begun to happen was there was a conference in Brazil in terms of on technology, because there's so many different stakeholders in that. Or take what's going on now in terms of Apple and what is happening in terms of digital technology in Europe. When do they come to the table? How are they part of the system? And we're not set. I think that is someplace where actually the academy could also get involved in thinking up the structure that was set up in 1945 may not be the best way to do things at this point, and the institutions don't work. And one of the things that I found is that generally, I kind of, there are huge trends going on at the moment that have a double-edged sword. Globalization, which clearly has brought us all together, but also has created problems because it's faceless, and so countries don't feel they have an identity, and all of a sudden nationalism is rampant. The other big thing out there that's a trend is technology. Technology makes it possible for us to know all kinds of things, and people in Africa to pay their bills by mobile phones, etc. But what it has also done is disaggregate people's voices. I believe in political parties. But what has happened, if you look at Egypt, there was social media and phones that were at Tahrir Square, but they didn't really change, didn't have enough effect on institutions. So I stole this line from somebody, but it works so well I keep repeating it. People are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments hear them on 20th century technology and are providing 19th century responses. And so there's no faith in institutions, whether they are the national institutions or the international institutions. And I think this all takes a lot of thought at the moment, that we're not dealing with the issues out there in a responsive way, and therefore are creating pockets of either nationalism or disaffection or dissatisfaction, and part of the anger that we see. And so there has to be some, and I do think this is a place where the academy could in fact help in terms of thinking through what some new institutional structures might be.
So that's a great transition to getting to your questions. So let me invite members of the audience to come up to the microphones and have a chance to ask Secretary Albright your questions. If you could just identify yourself, please, that's always helpful. And I'm trying to see where the mics are. I see one. Where are they? So there's one there and one there. Okay, so some people should go to this side just because the plan was to go back and forth, so we have equal numbers.
Okay.
I can't actually see the mic on this side, but I will assume that there's somebody there, and there, that's helpful, thank you. Because I'm sure Secretary Albright would like to. So why don't we start on this side?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear?
Yes, I can.
You can hear me? Mm-hmm. I told my friends not to be embarrassed when I did this, but 1968 Wellesley Raw.
Yay. 1959 Wellesley Raw.
Oh, love it. There are a lot of future world leaders in this room. I suspect that they do not know that everything they do, as small or large, will be watched by other people. I'm entranced by your book on pins. can you talk, and the impact they have when you walk into the room. Can you talk a little bit about the pins you wear?
Yes, thank you for asking that because it's kind of fun. And how it all started. I clearly like jewelry. So what happened when I was at the United Nations, I was an instructed ambassador, and it was the end of the Gulf War, and the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions. So my instructions were to say perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein constantly. And he deserved it. He'd invaded Kuwait. So all of a sudden, a poem appeared in the papers in Baghdad, comparing me to many things, but among them an unparalleled serpent. And so I had a snake pin, and I decided to wear it during the UN when we talked about Iraq. And then I think you've all seen how the ambassadors go out and talk to the press when it's over, and the cameras zero in, the reporter says, "Why are you wearing that snake pin?" And I said, because Saddam Hussein compared me to a serpent. And I thought, well, this is fun. So I went out and I bought a bunch of costume jewelry to depict whatever I thought we were going to do on any given day at the UN. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons. And on bad days, I wore carnivorous animals and spiders and things. And the first President Bush had said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." So when people said, "What are we going to do today?" I said, "Read my pins." And that's how it all started. So my pins now are traveling around in a collection. And the part that's fun about it is, to go back to the Madam Secretary issue, I love foreign policy, and I try really hard to make it less foreign. And because I think in a democracy, people need to understand better what we're doing. And so the pins are a great vehicle for telling foreign policy stories and explaining why I wore something at any given time. So, for instance, at a certain stage, I wanted to talk about our relations with the Russians and missiles. And I was negotiating an adjustment of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And I had a pin that was actually an arrow but looked like a missile. So at the time I was negotiating, Igor Ivanov, the foreign minister, said to me, "Is that one of your interceptors?" And I said, "Yes, and we make them very small, and you better negotiate." But it gives me an opportunity to talk about something. I have a lot of pins that are kind of Americana and a lot of fun. And the show just left the Nixon Library, and it's going to be in San Francisco, and it's going to go on a little bit longer. But thanks for asking. It's a lot of fun. You have to have a little bit of fun. And other people do notice. The only thing I had today that was orange was this flower.
So we read your pins. And I also want to say, for those who can't see, she's also wearing a Pan Am 103 Remembrance
Yes,
pin.
I am, definitely, yeah.
What's your favorite book?
Goodness. You know, my favorite book, actually, which I have reread, is War and Peace. I find it, when I read it the first time as a girl, it was only for the romance. Now I read it for the battles, and then I also read it in terms of trying to understand a lot of how countries and why countries fight, what the history of something is. And I use it a lot in my classes in terms, I don't happen to be a fatalist the way Tolstoy is, but the role of individuals, I think, comes out very strongly.
Excellent.
I could say the Bible, but anyway.
But you're...
No.
Hello.
Yes.
My question concerns a particular case. In 2007, in your letter to President Bush, you encouraged him to back the Moroccan proposition on the autonomy of the Western Sahara. And I quote you, this says that the people of the Western Sahara, it will give the people of Western Sahara a true voice in their future through the full benefits of autonomy as presented by Moroccan. A credible political solution can be achieved. In this particular case, what do you think, as a former member of the UN system and as a former Secretary of State, of the lack of neutrality that the UN Secretary General just had on this case?
It's interesting that you raised that because it has created a big issue all of a sudden. Part of the thing, interestingly enough, when I was at the UN, we dealt with this fairly frequently. It was an issue that somehow has not gotten resolved in terms of the Polisario and the number of, you were talking about former officials that get involved in this, Jim Baker and various people. And part of the problem is, I think, to put it into context, there are issues out there that have gone on a very long time unresolved that create problems when a time could be where, in fact, more cooperation between Morocco and Algeria, and looking at what's happening across all of North Africa, it would be useful if it were solved. I think the issue of the Secretary General getting involved in it has clearly created a lack of, it's done the opposite of what I think it could have in terms of getting Morocco and Algeria to try to figure out how to operate at the moment in a very complex period in North Africa. But it would be good if it were resolved.
Over here, please.
Hey, Madeleine. My name's Seth. Nice to meet you over the mic. I got a quick question about your relationship with Mr. Clinton. How would you say, like, your relationship was? Like, were there times when, you know, you'd be like, hey, Bill, we got to do this, but then, you know, he would counter and say, hey, Madeleine, no, we need to focus more on this? Like, what was that dynamic like?
Well, first of all, he is one of the most interesting and well-read people ever, and somebody that was a pleasure to work for, because what he did, he was really interested. And when we talked about, you know, wanting to hear diverse views, he was fantastic in trying to get us to argue in front of him. He really liked that. I do have to say the following thing, and one of the issues, to go back again to what it was like to be the first, well, first the UN and then Secretary of State, and trying to make my voice heard among a group of men, was what the president would say when I was UN ambassador: I want to hear what Madeleine has to say. And he made it much easier for me in this position of being the only woman in the room. I think that what he also was very open to having us say, this might not be the right way to go. And he really, I think, respected our different views, and he was very, very interesting. And I think he was remarkable in his capability of absorbing a lot of different views. A lot of fun to work for.
Now, let me follow up that with a question which I find interesting here, which is, you'd known President Clinton well before he was president, when he was governor, when he was a former governor. How does it change? You know, you had a relationship with him. He used to come to your house when he was still a candidate. How does it change when all of a sudden this person that you've known as a colleague, a friend, all of a sudden becomes Mr. President?
Well, let me say, I think you and I might have met him initially together. Jim and I go way back. Among the things that we did was work for Governor Michael Dukakis during his presidential campaign, and there was debate prep. And Bill Clinton came up to prep Dukakis for debate prep. Then what happened, and we got to know each other then. Then I was teaching at Georgetown. He had gone to Georgetown, and so we kind of developed a relationship over that. And we did get to be friends. And I actually called him Bill. I don't call him Bill. I call him Mr. President. And he really was somebody that it was very interesting, because when I was being asked about what his foreign policy experience was when he was running, I would say, well, he did go to the School of Foreign Service. He was not somebody that had particularly a foreign policy background. And he did come to my house a lot. And I think that one of the things that I think is important, one has to respect the office of president. And I think because I had worked for other presidents and was much older than everybody else at the White House, I would always stand up when he came into the room. Not everybody always did that. And I really did call him Mr. President, and I do to this day. But he is somebody, we talk to each other on the phone quite often now. And I enjoy continuing that relationship with him. He is really smart. I do have to say the following thing. which is I would not have been Secretary of State if it hadn't been for Hillary. And the reason I know that is because he said so publicly. What happened was, at the time that there was this mentioning whether their woman could be Secretary of State, what happened was I'm ultimately named Secretary of State, and the three of us often went to countries together. And I would introduce her, she would introduce him, and we were someplace in Central America, and he actually said the following thing, which is during that period, Hillary would come to him and say, "Why wouldn't you name Madeleine? She is the one most in tune with your views, expresses them better than anybody else, and besides, it would make your mother happy." So this is...
Over here, please.
Thank you.
By the way, if I can go back on something, he was a president who read a lot, and it goes to the book issue. He would read a lot and assign books to us. So one he told me to read was The Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin, that is the history of how the modern Middle East was created. And I refer to it practically every day. Because I've just come from the Middle East, and knowing that the modern Middle East, as a result of that book, was created, the short version of it was created by the British and French bureaucracies lying to each other and creating artificial countries. That was a book that he recommended.
Please.
Hi, I have 2 questions for you. I'm an alum out of the School of Engineering and Computer Science, so I'm curious about your personal use of technology. Do you have a tablet? Do you have favorite apps? Any issues with email? Second question is, you have a wonderful sense of humor. Can you comment in your career, how has your sense of humor helped or hindered you? Thank you.
Right. Well, first of all, I'm doing my best on technology. I do have a computer, I have a tablet, I have a Twitter account, I did, you know that ad that's out there where 2 grandparents, their young kids are coming over saying, "So glad to see you," and they turn on all their technology? I do need help on that. There are a lot of people that are surprised that I have a sense of humor because I think I developed it while I was in office, and it does help. And partially, I think, in terms of trying to turn something into a joke. I can't think of anything specific at the moment, but it is really important, I think, to be able to sometimes kind of make a situation less tense by telling a story. And I do think that one of the issues has been in terms of some of these former foreign ministers. For instance, when the Brits said representation without taxation, I think that it's possible then to say, yeah, look where we are and look where you are. So, but I think that you have to get to know people well. And I have said, people are surprised that I actually have a sense of humor. So thank you for noticing.
Over here, please.
Hi, my name's Sarah Nevin. I'm a sophomore broadcast journalism major, and you touched on the refugee crisis a little bit earlier, and so I was wondering, what role or responsibility do you think the U.S. should have in responding to the refugee crisis?
No. Let me say this. I am a refugee. I don't have a terrible story. As I said, we came to the United States. My father was a diplomat. He defected, and we were stateless for a while, and we were known as DPs. My father wrote this very cute story about Mr. DP discovers America. And by the way, as an immigrant, the first person to call me when I was named Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger. And he said, "Madeleine, you have taken away my one unique characteristic of being an immigrant Secretary of State." And I said, "No, Henry, I don't have an accent." So, I do feel that this country has been unbelievably generous to refugees, and without sounding self-serving, I think refugees have done some things that are useful for this country. And I didn't become, you're a sophomore? I did not become an American citizen until I was between my sophomore and junior year at Wellesley. And so I am incredibly grateful for being welcomed by this country. And I do think that we should be able, actually, what is going on in Europe is horrendous. And it is very hard for us to tell the Europeans what to do if we aren't taking in more people. I fly across the United States a lot. We are a very big country, and there's plenty of room. And I think that the issue is how to have, I got this chart in my office about the vetting system that we have. It's a very intense vetting system. I think it's a matter of putting more people into the process, doing the vetting and really being able to take more people. And it's very hard. For instance, I was in Jordan some time ago, and I went to the Syrian camp there. There's also a Iraqi camp and a Palestinian camp. And in terms of proportion, the number of refugees that are in Jordan, it's as though we had 40 million refugees in the United States, and we're having trouble doing something with 11 billion undocumented workers. And so I think we should do more. Yeah.
Please.
First and foremost, thank you for your time, Madam Secretary. My name is Austin Chakowski. I'm a freshman here at Syracuse University. And of course, granted, hindsight is 20/20, but do you believe that during your administration there were any actions that could be taken to prevent the 21st century rise of Al-Qaeda and consequently the United States? And if not, do you believe that these Islamic terrorist groups are going to become perpetual enemies to the United States for both my generation and all generations to follow?
Yeah. Believe me, we all kind of go back and look at this. I think that, and let me just give a little bit of context. I am now, speaking of former officials, doing a task force under the auspices of the Atlantic Council, taking a deeper look at what's happened in the Middle East in terms of trying to figure out what the source of Daesh, ISIL really has been, and Al-Qaeda, and try to figure out what went wrong at various times. I think that we did begin to deal with terrorist issues. When I was at the United Nations was the first attack on the World Trade Center. And then, as I said, there were the issues that happened in Kenya and Tanzania. Al-Qaeda was involved in that. We did try to go after Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, there were issues that are similar to the ones that are dealt with now. Do you take a missile attack if you know that civilians are involved in it? So some of the questions, the moral questions are there. I think that, let me just say, I'm trying to do this without being overly critical, but one of the things that happened when we left office, the Clinton administration, we briefed the Bush people coming in saying that terrorism would be a very big deal because we had begun to see the problems. And there were no meetings at the principals levels before 9/11. So I think that maybe we weren't strong enough in the way that we stated the problems of it. But I think we began to see the issues. I think our problem generally is trying to figure out what creates the terrorists. And part of it has to do with conditions that are there, the vacuums that have been created, and various ways that the Afghan war and the Iraq war were prosecuted. So 20/20 hindsight is pretty good, and I think our main problem now is trying to figure out how to separate those people that are miserable and can't make a living where they are, and those that for some reason believe that they have a special mission in life to destroy others. We need to understand better who is involved in it and what creates them. But it's the biggest issue of our time, obviously, and how not to create more terrorists. That's the problem. I happen to think that it's a mistake to talk about a war on terror because that makes those who are fighting us warriors when they're murderers. And so vocabulary in this is very important.
So we've got a lot of people in line, and our time is getting short. I'm going to let's do one more on each side and see how the time goes, but let's go over here.
Thank you for being here, Madam Secretary. I'd like to thank you as a high school teacher, a woman, an American citizen for your service to our nation.
Thank you.
I am, as I mentioned, a local area high school teacher, and I teach a course on human rights. And as you may know, a couple of days from now will be the commemoration of the beginning of the Rwandan genocide. I'd like you to speak, and when I teach my students about this, they often ask, What happened there? Where was the United Nations? Where was the United States? And I wonder if you would speak about that. I know this is another hindsight 2020 question, but if you'd speak about that, I would
Very
appreciate
much. Thank you for asking. I do teach, and when I teach a course on the tools of the National Security Toolbox and what we do with the tools. And I'm going to try not to talk for 50 minutes, but I taught about this yesterday, about the role of the United States in humanitarian intervention. And this is the issue. And I think, and again, Jim, it goes to something we talked about in how you do priorities and what the decision is and what is going on. Rwanda, for me, is one of the worst things that happened on our watch, but I can explain why it happened. It might not do any good, but I'd like to explain it, is that you have to think about the things that were going on at the same time. Initially, when I talked about what we were doing, Somalia had been an operation that had been started as a humanitarian operation by the Bush people and then changed into a military operation. And what happened, if you remember, Black Hawk Down, and Americans were dragged through the streets, and I had to go on TV trying to explain what we were doing there, why that had happened. Then we also were in Bosnia. There also were problems in Haiti. We had sent the aircraft carrier there that had to be turned around. And so there was a contextual thing in terms of other things happening and what was the role of the U.S. The major problem, however, was the following, and this is the hindsight issue. It is easy for people who are writing about what happened to have the information now, but at the time, we didn't have the information. We were in the Security Council, and there was a man that represented the Secretary General who would come in every day and tell us about the horrors of the world. And Rwanda was just one of the many things that were going on without any, and Rwanda was sitting on the Security Council. And we did not have the kind of information that has been available since. Then what happens is that the airplane of the Hutu president was shot down, and I call it volcanic genocide. Then we were trying to figure out what to do. You were talking about Ibrahim Gambari. I was an instructed ambassador, and the Nigerian representative starts giving us much more information. My instructions were not to enlarge the UN force there. I got up from my seat, went to call Washington and said, I need new instructions. And I was told to stick with my instructions. We did not know enough about what was going on. But President Clinton, over and over again, has asked us, still to this day, what happened? And my only explanation is the context of what was going on, a lack of information, and, this is the worst part, even if we'd known it, we couldn't get there fast enough. And so it was volcanic genocide. When rolling genocide was happening in Darfur, we didn't go there either. So one of the hardest parts, and it goes to the initial question Jim asked, is when does the United States get involved? And the issue is, I believe we should have been in Rwanda, but it's one of those, I said to my students yesterday, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. There are places where we've been that people are critical of what we did, and places where we didn't go where people are equally critical. And that is the hardest part about decision making. But we all regret Rwanda. I went there afterwards. I went to the church where the people were murdered. I went to the places where they were digging up bodies. It was horrendous. And the people that it was hardest, I went to the jails, and there were nuns in jail, and they were some of the ones that had committed the genocide. It's a horrible story. And so, but it needs to be understood in the context. Thanks for asking it.
Thank you for your answer.
I'm going to do one more over here, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. I'm a freshman international relations student, and I was wondering if you could share some things that you wish you knew before you were Secretary of State that would have helped you while you were Secretary of State.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, let me say that I think just generally the issues, I think I was pretty good on issues. I mean, I'd spent my whole life studying it. I also knew that I could always get the information that I wanted. I mean, part of the government is to provide incredible information. I think the part that's hardest is you don't do, Thank God you don't do it by yourself. But the bottom line is how you can figure out who the people are that are providing you advice and information. You walk into the State Department, and there are all of a sudden all kinds of people you've never seen before, and you are dependent on them for information. So making judgments about who is giving you information, and having respect for people when they argue in front of you, as I said, and being able to integrate a lot of new information. And then some of this decision-making of how, in my case, how I could argue for what I wanted without being told I was emotional, and trying to figure out how to operate in a way that allows you to work through the decision-making process. But I think in every job you have to learn. And I loved international relations all my life. And as I said, there is, you know, people say, what do you miss? Everything. Because I loved what you learn and the intelligence aspect of it and really being up to date on issues. So thanks. Yeah.
So let me apologize to the other people here. We've gone past our time, and other people have classes, including some of our faculty here who have to go teach. Madeleine, thank you. You know, one of the things that I hope others take away, as I do from this, which is that the challenges of being in public life and of making the decisions and having responsibility for these very tough questions that we've been talking about today are really difficult ones. And often people don't agree with the decisions you make, and often they have good reasons to disagree, and that there are good arguments on both sides. But for the courage and the willingness to stand up and do that and to take on the public service is something that we all here at Syracuse University and Maxwell, you know, take very seriously. The obligation to leave the city more beautiful than we found it. And I would say indisputably that your service to your nation and to the world has been part of very much in that spirit of the Athenian oath of trying to make the world better than the one that you found. So thank you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.